If you want to understand how ordinary people survived total war, you don't start with generals or grand strategy. You start in the kitchen, the shed, the cellar, and the hallway of an average home. War didn't just reshape borders, it rewired daily life. Households were expected to become miniature survival units, capable of feeding themselves, repairing what broke, protecting against air raids, and coping with long-term scarcity. The tools people kept weren't conveniences. They were lifelines. And what's striking is how deliberately chosen they were. Nothing was decorative, nothing was redundant, and nothing went unused for long. In the first year of war, many families still believed the conflict might be brief. By the second, it was obvious that survival depended on preparation at the most basic level. Governments issued guidance, but it was households that adapted, improvised, and endured. If you study these tools closely, you begin to see a blueprint for resilience that still matters today. This is where we move past nostalgia and into hard lessons. Why wartime households treated tools as strategic assets rather than household clutter. In wartime, Britain, Germany, the Soviet Union, and much of occupied Europe, household tools were considered extensions of national survival. Factories were bombed, shops emptied, and replacements could take months or never arrive. A broken hinge, cracked saucepan or dull blade wasn't an inconvenience, it was a vulnerability. Families learned quickly that if something broke and you couldn't fix it yourself, you simply did without. This is why, basic repair tools became essential. A hammer, a small handsaw, screwdrivers, nails, wire and pliers were standard. These weren't stored away for rare use. They lived close at hand because repairs were constant. Windows shattered from blast waves, furniture was repurposed into fuel, and crates became shelves or even chicken coops. The practical lesson here is simple and honestly still relevant. Self-repair capacity is more valuable than stockpiling replacements. A modern parallel is, maintaining tools and skills that allow you to fix clothing, furniture, and basic infrastructure rather than relying on fragile supply chains. Why knives, grinders, and hand-powered kitchen tools kept families alive. Wartime kitchens were stripped of convenience. Electricity was unreliable. Gas was rationed, and food arrived in unfamiliar forms. Tinned meat with bone fragments, whole grains instead of flour, root vegetables caked in soil, and offcuts that required serious preparation were the norm. This made cutting tools central to survival. A good knife was sharpened constantly, often with a handstone kept near the stove. Meat grinders, hand-cranked slicers, and heavy cleavers allowed families to stretch poor-quality ingredients into usable meals. Bread was baked at home because store-bought loaves were scarce or, heavily rationed. That required mixing bowls, wooden spoons, and strong arms. The practical application today isn't about reenactment, it's about understanding dependency. When systems fail, the ability to process raw food matters more than recipe books. A household that can grind, cut, preserve and cook without electricity is structurally resilient. Wartime families didn't romanticize this. They practiced it daily. Why sewing kits and repair needles mattered as much as food rations. Clothing shortages hit civilians early and honestly stayed brutal. New garments were rare, fabrics were redirected to uniforms, and shoes were nearly impossible to replace. Every household owned sewing needles, thread, patches and scissors. Children's clothes were let out, taken in and remade repeatedly. Adult coats were turned inside out to hide wear. Blankets became jackets. Flour sacks became shirts. This wasn't hobby sewing. It was logistical maintenance of the body. Cold killed just as effectively as bombs, you know. From a survival perspective, the ability to maintain insulation and protection is fundamental. The wartime lesson is clear. Clothing durability and repairability are survival skills, not lifestyle choices. Even today, knowing how to patch, reinforce and adapt garments extends resources dramatically during economic or supply disruptions. Why fuel-saving tools shaped daily routines and survival odds? Fuel scarcity forced households to rethink heat and cooking. Coal, wood and charcoal were rationed or, quite often, just unavailable. Families used small iron stoves, fire pokers, ash shovels and heat-retaining cookware to maximize every calorie of fuel. Lids stayed on pots. Cooking was consolidated into single sessions. Rooms were closed off to preserve warmth. Tools that allowed fuel efficiency, really mattered more than comfort. Thermometers were used to judge cooking heat without waste. Kettles were kept hot rather than reheated, which, saved precious fuel. The modern application here is what we call energy literacy. Wartime households, they understood energy flow intimately. Folks measured, conserved and planned every bit. That mindset, honestly, applies directly to modern energy insecurity and off-grid living. Why first aid kits and civil defence tools were standard household equipment, you might wonder. Air raids made medical self-sufficiency non-negotiable. Every household was expected to maintain basic first aid supplies. Bandages, disinfectants, scissors and splints were common, really. In many cities, gas masks were stored by the door, ready to be grabbed in seconds. Buckets of sand, water and stirrup pumps were kept to fight incendiary fires before they spread. This wasn't paranoia. It was survival math. Emergency services were overwhelmed or, sometimes just unreachable. Immediate response determined outcomes. The lesson for today is preparedness without drama. Knowing how to stop bleeding, treat burns, and respond to environmental hazards remains honestly one of the most transferable wartime skills. Why preservation tools turn seasonal abundance into long-term survival. Households preserved relentlessly. Glass jars, lids, salt crocks, smoking racks and root cellars transformed temporary abundance into winter security. Canning wasn't optional. It was the difference between eating and starving months later. Families tracked yields, spoilage and consumption carefully. Applied today, this is about time-shifting resources. Preservation reduces dependency on continuous availability. It builds buffers. Wartime households didn't waste surplus because, they understood uncertainty. That mindset, remains relevant in any unstable system. Why these tools still matter if you understand what they represented. These weren't just quaint artifacts, they were deliberate adaptations to systemic stress. Each tool solved a specific vulnerability: food access, warmth, repair, health and energy. Together, they formed a decentralized survival network inside every home. If you study them seriously, you're not learning how people lived in the past. You're learning how people endure when systems fail. That's, honestly, why this knowledge matters. If this kind of grounded, no-nonsense history is what you value, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts, share this with someone who still believes resilience is abstract, and, well, keep these lessons alive.